Hello, everyone. My name's Tori, and I was half paralyzed 6 months ago. I went from an elite athlete to being entirely half paralyzed on the left side of my body. So, what happened? Why did it happen? Why was it so bad in my particular case? I made an Instagram post about this, but I think it's time to sum up all of the key points in an actual video. I aim to tell my story as it happened in hopes to explain a very misunderstood topic and educate the community. I think there's a lot to learn from this experience. To start out, I thought I was prepared. I brought oxygen, but I didn't bring enough of it. That'll be an ongoing theme. What's worse, when I really needed the help, I was stuck in a hospital that couldn't treat me. I was there for 3 critical days waiting on a time-sensitive intervention. Many people might think that a week of rest leading into a dive would have prevented this. But in my case, you would be wrong. I'd like to talk about all of this in the upcoming video and try to dispel any myth, misconception, rumor, or outright folklore that surrounds this particular topic. Let's get into it. Before we dive in, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's very small. Every little bit counts. As far as I know, I'm only one of 2, maybe 3 people that have experienced decompression sickness at this level, and I'm definitely the only one documenting it from start to finish. So if you want to be part of this unique comeback story, please subscribe to the YouTube channel, and if you enjoy the video, be sure to give it a like later on. Now let's get back to it. If you rest enough, you can avoid risk of DCS. In my case, that would be inaccurate. I've had DCS severely 3 times. The first time was in Dominica, 2022, and that occurred after 9 days of rest. I only did one 92-meter dive, and that was after 9 days of rest. What transpired was full left side paralysis for about 40 minutes. Luckily, I was able to breathe 100% oxygen during that 40-minute period, and it permanently alleviated all of the symptoms. I flushed out the nitrogen bubble. The second time was at Vertical Blue Training 2022, and this was a result of one 100-meter dive. That's right, only one. And that was after a 2-day rest period, a very common practice amongst freedivers. 2 days of rest, dive deep. 2 days of rest, dive deep. Very common. I believe on that particular instance, it was dehydration that caused it, but I want to talk about that in a later upcoming video. The third occasion, and the most severe occasion that just occurred, was a single 105-meter bifin dive. What within my capability of doing? This all happened after 1 week of rest. As you can see, rest alone does not protect you from the risk of DCS, at least in my case. On every occasion, I did one dive, and I had ample amount of rest leading into it. So what precautions can be taken? Over the past 4 years, I've come to know that there are certain things you should do to mitigate the risk of DCS. I want to talk about what has worked for me and what hasn't worked for me. My experience has taught me that it's more important to have post-dive precautions than pre-dive precautions. Have 100% oxygen, have it nearby, and have it ready to breathe underwater, ideally, to recompress. So what happened in my case? If I already knew all of this, where did things go wrong? Well, I'm glad you asked. I had oxygen, but I didn't have enough of it. After experiencing DCS at Vertical Blue Training 2022, I made it a priority to always have oxygen nearby and within reach for immediate post-dive breathing. Whether that meant floating at the surface or 5 meters underwater, I would breathe 5 minutes worth of oxygen. Even floating at the surface mimics the pressure to a very small degree, creating a slight simulation of what happens in a hyperbaric chamber. That's the reasoning behind this practice. Every time I've experienced DCS symptoms, they've always started to show up 10 to 15 minutes after the dive has occurred. Because of that pattern, I made it a habit to always be breathing 100% oxygen within that 10 to 15 minute period, and for at least 5 minutes. This was always enough to prevent the symptoms from occurring in the first place. But this time was different. It was incredibly different. The symptoms started to occur within like 2 minutes of surfacing after the dive. That was faster than the time it took to surface, recover, and make it to the oxygen in time. The difference here is that the symptoms had already started before I could even get to the oxygen. Now I was dealing with a situation where I wasn't trying to prevent the symptoms anymore. Instead, I was now dealing with full-on decompression sickness with only a preventative amount of oxygen. So I started breathing 5 to 7 minutes worth of oxygen underwater, and it alleviated all of my symptoms instantly. We all started celebrating, but that celebration turned out to be premature. It wasn't enough to alleviate the symptoms for good. Within about 10 to 15 minutes of finishing the oxygen, I started to feel the weakness come back. It was then I really started to understand how dire my situation was. At that point, it became a race. I needed to swim to shore and hop on a scooter just to get to another bottle of 100% oxygen. So that's exactly what we did. I was half paralyzed. None of this was easy. We got to shore, hopped on the scooter, secured another bottle of oxygen, and rushed back out to the water to try recompressing again. By this time, more than an hour had elapsed since the initial symptoms had occurred. Mind you, this is over an hour I had been half paralyzed. I didn't know if another round of recompression would actually work, but to my surprise, it did. All of my symptoms were alleviated immediately after being paralyzed for over an hour. I got underwater, started breathing the oxygen, all of my symptoms, all of my movement, all of my strength, it came back. Every symptom of DCS disappeared. But just like before, they weren't gone for good. I still didn't have enough oxygen. After resurfacing, about 10 to 15 minutes later, I started to feel the weakness come back. I didn't have enough oxygen to fully flush out that nitrogen bubble in my brain. The takeaway from this experience is very simple. I didn't have enough oxygen on that day to permanently alleviate these symptoms. And if I did, none of this would have happened. My second major mistake was simple, going to a hospital that had no capability or resources to treat me. I won't dive into all of the details about how unprepared they were or how little they knew about decompression sickness, but I can tell you that every morning I woke up expecting a promised transfer to a facility that could treat me, only to be met by a new doctor asking who I was, why I was there, and what happened. Even this was difficult because I was starting to lose the ability to speak. Where I really went wrong is that I knew this hospital was unequipped to handle my situation. I knew they didn't have an operational hyperbaric chamber. I knew that. What I assumed, however, is that they could facilitate a transfer to the neighboring island that did have an operating hyperbaric chamber. That assumption alone was my second biggest mistake of the day, and it would prove to be crucial. Believing the hospital would handle the transfer was entirely my error. The reality is, I was scared to hop on a ferry to get to the neighboring island while being half paralyzed. But the truth is, that's what I had to do anyway once the unequipped hospital finally transferred me. I had to do it anyway, so I should have done it in the first place. Instead, I ended up stuck at a hospital, marinating for 3 days with a nitrogen bubble in my brain. And those 3 days of letting that nitrogen bubble sit in my brain drastically worsened my condition. 2 mistakes you shouldn't make. Always bring oxygen. More importantly, bring enough of it. Not having enough oxygen on this day was my biggest mistake. Have an escape plan for a worst case scenario. Don't assume reaching a hospital means you're safe. Hospitals can feel like prisons. Some countries require payment before letting you leave. Crossing the hospital threshold doesn't mean you've crossed the finish line. Don't make my same mistake. Before I wrap this up, I want to leave you with one thought. Why has this happened to me multiple times? Why do some people dive their entire lives without ever experiencing something like this? While for me, it's been a recurring issue. It's a question I've asked myself over and over again, and it's led me to consider the possibility of a PFO, a patent foramen oval. That's the medical terminology. A PFO is a small hole in the heart that some people are born with, and it can have a significant impact on decompression sickness and diving. Interesting enough, about 25% of the general population has a PFO, often without ever knowing it. The more you know. So why aren't more freedivers getting decompression sickness? Well, they're probably not diving over 90 meters. While not an inherent requirement, depth does play a factor. Now, I've been tested for a PFO on 3 separate occasions, and each time the results came back negative. However, I was tested with a less accurate ultrasound method, probably 80% accurate. There's a more advanced and precise test, and I'm hoping to undergo that test specifically in the future to get a definitive answer. But that's a story for another time. So stay tuned, and if you're curious about how a PFO might relate to my experiences, I'll dive deeper into that in an upcoming video. So please subscribe and stay tuned, and like the video if you learned something.